Welcome to Whisper's Secrets. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss a secret. The autumn light slanted low across the rolling fields of southern Illinois in 1985, casting long golden shadows over silos and barns and the rust-streaked backs of pickup trucks that had seen 3 presidents come and go without ever once leaving the county line. And in the back room of a modest red brick house just outside of Effingham, Tom Whitaker sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of unopened letters from the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Social Security Administration, and one from his eldest son, each one carrying a weight heavier than any rucksack he had worn during his 2 tours in Vietnam. And as the wind rustled the faded American flag above the porch, Tom could still hear the sound of jungle rot chewing through canvas, the staccato rattle of an M60 in the distance, and the soft, brittle voice of a 19-year-old soldier named Whitaker whispering, "We all die over here, just in different ways." And it wasn't that Tom had never left the war. It was that the war had never left him, clinging to his ribs and his routines, shaping every choice he made after 1971 when he returned home with half a lung, a bronze star, and eyes that had stopped blinking at gunfire. And yet what haunted him more than the war was the decades that followed, the choices he made not on the battlefield but around the dinner table, in courtrooms, in tax offices, and in hollow phone calls to children who had begun to speak to him as if they were reading from a script written by someone else. And he remembered clearly the moment it all began to fray, April 15, 1979, when the steel mill where he had worked since '72, Union Midwestern Steel, announced it would be shuttering, not because of bankruptcy but because of restructuring following the Volcker shock. When the Federal Reserve jacked up interest rates to break inflation and corporate investors began bleeding Midwest industries dry, shipping labor to the South or overseas, and Tom, with 3 kids under 12, a wife who suffered from lupus, and a mortgage he had only half paid, was told that his pension would be reviewed, and that he could file for unemployment, like everyone else. And he tried, God knows he tried, taking shifts at a grain elevator, then at a truck stop, then applying for federal retraining programs that seemed designed more to humiliate than to help. And when none of it worked, he did what only a desperate man would do. He sold the land that had been in his family for generations to a corporate agri-firm that promised to keep the topsoil and the legacy. And Tom took that money and used every last dollar to pay off the house, buy medication for his wife, and put his kids through college, David, the oldest, to Indiana University, Rebecca to Illinois State, and little Jonah, who loved drawing tractors more than school, to a vocational school in Decatur. And he told himself that sacrifice was what fathers did, that history didn't need to remember him so long, as his children had a chance to outrun the past. But as the years turned and the jobs didn't come back, and the unions faded into memory, and Reagan stood at podiums declaring, "Morning in America," Tom sat on that same porch watching his neighbors lose their farms, their hope, and eventually, their sons to the opioid crisis before anyone knew what OxyContin even was, and through it all, he stayed quiet, proud, not out of ignorance but because he believed deeply in the deal, you give everything, and your family remembers. But it was in 1985 that the phone call came that rewrote everything. David, now a junior legal advisor at a Chicago law firm with a freshly shined BMW and an apartment on the Magnificent Mile, called to say he had found some irregularities in the way Tom had handled the land sale, and that for tax reasons he was being audited by the IRS. And Tom, stunned, asked why David hadn't told him sooner, and his son, his own flesh and blood, said, "It's complicated, Dad, but you might want to get a lawyer." And Tom knew in that moment that something had broken, not just in the family, but in the contract he had built his whole life around, because within weeks, he began receiving notices that certain funds from the land sale were being contested under David's name, that Rebecca had co-signed on a refinance loan he never agreed to, and that Jonah, sweet Jonah, had gone silent, no longer returning calls. And when Tom drove up to Chicago in person, wearing his best flannel, and holding a folder of neatly organized receipts, David refused to meet with him, sending down a junior associate to handle things. And the look that young man gave him, That thin smile of pity reserved for men who smell like wood smoke and don't know how to navigate systems, was worse than a bullet, and Tom returned home, stunned, and found that the utilities had been switched into someone else's name, his mailbox filled with foreclosure threats, and a letter from Rebecca's husband, a real estate developer, offering to help him relocate to a more manageable property. And it was then that Tom realized the truth. They weren't trying to help. They were trying to erase him, to convert his sacrifices into assets, to fold him into the very system he had bled to protect. And as he stood on the back porch of the house his great-grandfather had built with Civil War money, watching the soy fields turn to dusk, he whispered Ortega's words again. "We all die over here, just in different ways." And the next morning, he packed a duffel with 3 changes of clothes, a .38 revolver he hadn't touched since Saigon, and the last family photograph taken before the mill closed, and he started driving west, not to escape, but to find out how far a man has to go to prove he was never the villain they made him out to be. Tom Whitaker drove west with the slow deliberation of a man who had nothing left to hurry toward and nothing left to lose, the kind of driving done not with purpose but with momentum, fueled by muscle memory and the quiet inertia of rage too old to boil but too fresh to settle. And as the highway unfurled across the flat, rust-colored heartland between Illinois and Oklahoma, he passed the ghosts of towns that had once hummed with the machinery of American optimism, abandoned diners shuttered, feed stores, rusting water towers bearing the faded names of teams that hadn't played ball since the Ford administration, and he thought about how many men like him had driven these same roads over the last 2 decades, heads full of questions they couldn't articulate, hearts full of sacrifice no one asked for, betrayed not by bullets but by handshakes and silence, and he slept in rest stops and roadside motels, kept to cash payments, and ignored the news on the radios, because there was only one news item that mattered now: finding Jonah, the last of the 3, the boy who had once painted the family barn with bright red tempera in the summer of '73 while singing Conway Twitty at the top of his lungs, the son who had promised him at 16 that he'd never be like those lawyer boys in the city, and yet who had gone silent the moment Tom asked why his name had appeared on a quitclaim deed he hadn't signed, and all Tom had was a rumor, spoken by an old friend from the VFW hall back in Effingham, that Jonah had headed south after some kind of trouble in Missouri, maybe working construction or laying cable near the newly approved AT&T fiber expansion zones outside Tulsa. And so Tom followed the whispers until the dirt turned redder and the roads less familiar, and he finally found the job site listed on the back of a pay stub he'd intercepted in the stack of papers left on the kitchen table. And there he found Jonah, not in jail, not homeless, not dead, but wearing a reflective vest and operating a backhoe like it was a tank, laughing with 2 other men. And Tom didn't walk over right away, he just stood at the edge of the chain-link fence, hands in his jacket, watching, feeling something between relief and a deeper kind of ache, and when Jonah saw him, he froze, and the color drained from his sunburned face, and after a long minute, he walked over, took off his gloves, and said, "You weren't supposed to find me." And Tom said, "I wasn't supposed to be left behind." And they sat in the cab of Jonah's truck that night, drinking warm soda and talking like prisoners do, slow, careful, waiting to see who would flinch first. And Jonah confessed, not with shame but with exhaustion, that he had signed the deed under pressure, that David had framed it as a temporary restructuring to protect the family assets, that Rebecca had vouched for it, and that by the time Jonah realized what he'd done, the property had been legally transferred into a family trust run by a company David's firm advised. And Tom listened without interruption, then asked, "And why didn't you say anything?" And Jonah looked at the floor and said, "Because you always told us the family came first, even before you." And that sentence hit Tom harder than any minefield ever had, because it meant that the very values he had spent his life modeling had been turned into weapons against him, that his belief in sacrifice had been interpreted as permission to erase him, and he wanted to scream, to break the windshield, to do something that would make Jonah understand the depth of betrayal, but instead he only said, "You didn't protect the family, son, you commodified it." And Jonah began to cry, not loudly, not theatrically, but in that quiet, shaking way grown men do when they realize they've broken something sacred, and they parted without resolution, only a promise from Jonah to make it right. But Tom didn't believe in promises anymore, so he drove further west, ending up in Amarillo, Texas, where he found work repairing irrigation systems for a rancher who didn't ask questions and paid in cash. And there, in the dry air and silence, Tom began writing, not letters this time, not pleas, but a journal, a record of everything, from his service in the Mekong Delta to the union meetings of '76 to the bankruptcy filings of 1982. And he started mailing pages to a local newspaper editor he'd met by chance at a diner, a woman named Lydia whose father had also lost his land in the SNO crisis, and she agreed to publish the story in pieces, disguised as fiction, under a pseudonym, and soon, readers began sending letters, Vietnam vets, laid-off factory workers, divorced dads, even young people wondering why their families no longer spoke of grandparents with reverence. And the story spread, and Tom felt something he hadn't felt in years, relevance. The idea that maybe his life still mattered in the telling. And then, in the fall of 1987, he received a letter, not from Jonah, not from Rebecca, but from David's wife, Annette, a woman who had always treated Tom kindly at Thanksgiving and who now wrote, "You deserve to know. David used your military file to claim survivor benefits for a trust he wasn't eligible for." And enclosed was a photocopy of the application with forged documents, and Tom knew what it meant: felony fraud, disbarment, maybe prison. And he stared at it for a long time before calling Lydia, asking if she'd publish the final chapter without edits, and when she said yes, he mailed the entire manuscript to her, including the VA letters, the financial records, the court filings, and a single page titled The Whitaker Principle, where he wrote, "We inherit honor or we manufacture it, but either way, it's a choice, and my children chose to counterfeit mine." And then he drove back north, not to confront, but to witness, to stand in the courtroom in Springfield where David was eventually summoned to testify, and when asked by the judge if he had anything to say to the man he defrauded, David looked at Tom, then down at his hands and said, "I thought I was building a legacy." And Tom replied, "You were bulldozing one." And when it was over, and the headlines faded, and the trust was dissolved, Tom went home, not to the house, which he no longer owned, but to a modest trailer near the county line, where he kept a dog, a garden, and a shelf of letters from strangers who had read his story and found their own in it, and every morning, he raised the flag, brewed coffee, and sat on the porch facing east, because no matter how long the darkness lasted, he still believed in watching for light. The winter of 1988 wrapped central Illinois in a cold so dry and sharp it seemed to shave the skin off your knuckles just by standing outside too long. And Tom Whitaker, now living in a double-wide trailer parked at the edge of an unused soybean field near the Wabash River, spent his mornings shoveling frost-hardened soil for a makeshift drainage trench and his evenings reading letters from strangers who had read his serialized story in the Amarillo Ledger, now syndicated by a few small-town weeklies and one independent public radio station in Des Moines that ran excerpts under the title The Cost of Honor, and those letters had become the firewood of his spirit. Notes from Vietnam vets who said, "I thought no one else remembered what it was like to come home and be treated like you asked for what happened." From steelworkers in Youngstown and Gary who wrote, "They told us we'd be retrained, and then they just closed the door and left." And from younger men and women who asked things like, "Why don't my parents ever talk about your generation?" And, "How do you keep living when the world acts like you were never there?" And though Tom never replied directly, he saved every envelope, every folded line, and filed them in old cigar boxes next to newspaper clippings, military citations, and faded Polaroids of his kids before the betrayal, before the silence, before the names became signatures on legal documents that read more like surrender than love, and as the weeks passed, he began to feel something he hadn't in years. A purpose that didn't depend on being a father, or a husband, or a soldier, but on being a witness, a chronicler of the quiet erosion that had hollowed out men like him since the late 1970s, when American industry began outsourcing and patriotism became more about slogans than sacrifice. And it was in February, just after a snowstorm knocked out the radio antenna, that he received a call from Lydia, the reporter in Amarillo who had first agreed to publish his story, her voice crackling on the line with excitement and worry. "NPR wants to interview you, national segment, 10 minutes. And Tom, stunned, said nothing at first, then asked, "Why me?" And Lydia said, "Because you're the only one saying it straight." And though he resisted, said he wasn't polished, wasn't a talker, she convinced him, and 2 weeks later, sitting in the back room of the county library with headphones on and a technician named Carl feeding audio levels into a reel-to-reel machine, Tom told his story to a nation of strangers. And he spoke the way he always did, flat, clear, honest, not to perform, but to testify. And when the segment aired, titled, "The Forgotten Father," letters began pouring in by the hundreds, not just from the Midwest but from California, the Bronx, Arizona, the Pacific Northwest, and even a few from Canada and Germany, and many began their message the same way. "My dad never said these things, but I think he felt them." And Tom, reading them by lantern light, began to cry, not out of grief, but out of recognition, the feeling that he had finally done something that mattered beyond his property line. And it was during this quiet storm of public resonance that something unexpected happened. Jonah returned, not with excuses or apologies, but with a truck full of lumber, a welder, and 2 sleeping bags, and he said, "If you'll let me, I'd like to build a proper porch." And Tom, still wary, said, "Why now?" And Jonah replied, "Because I stopped being afraid of telling the truth." And over the course of that march, father and son worked side by side in the cold, rebuilding not just a porch but a kind of uneasy peace, hammer by nail, word by word, and slowly, Jonah began to open up about the things he'd never said, the pressure he'd felt to keep the family's face clean in front of David and Rebecca, the guilt he carried from signing the documents, the nights he drank alone in Tulsa wondering what kind of man he'd become. And Tom listened, not with forgiveness, but with presence. Because he had learned that love was no longer something he could give unconditionally. It had to be re-earned, reshaped, repurposed. And as the thaw came and grass returned to the field's edge, Tom received another call, this time from a retired professor of American labor history at Purdue who wanted to include his narrative in a curriculum pilot for underfunded high schools. And Tom, flustered, said, "I'm no textbook." But the professor replied, "You're exactly what we lost when the textbooks got cleaned up." And that phrase stuck with him, cleaned up, because he realized that's what David and Rebecca had tried to do, scrub him out of their history to make their story smoother, more palatable to the world they now lived in. And he wrote a final chapter for Lydia, titled, "A Man Without Erasure," where he explained that betrayal wasn't just what they did with his land or his name. It was the decision to act like he had never mattered. And in July of that year, just days after Independence Day, fireworks boomed across every county fairground, and Tom sat beneath them with a thermos of black coffee and a heart full of complicated pride. He received a letter from Rebecca, not formal, not legal, but handwritten, fragile, and raw, and it said, "I didn't know what we were doing until it was done. I let the system tell me you were in the way. I'm sorry." And enclosed was a check, not large, not symbolic, but enough to show that something had cracked in her, along with a photo of his granddaughter, Abigail, age 3, holding a flag at a Memorial Day parade. And that photo hit Tom harder than any courtroom verdict ever could, because it meant he still existed in someone's story, even if only as a whisper. And he placed the picture in a new frame, one carved by Jonah, and set it beside his medals, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that family, like country, will fail you if you mistake loyalty for silence. But if you speak, if you stand firm, if you hold the line long enough, the echoes might just find their way home. The spring of 1990 arrived like a second chance across the fields of southern Illinois, the earth cracking open with promise after a bitter winter, and for the first time in over a decade, Tom Whitaker allowed himself to hope, not in the sentimental, soft-focus way the magazines sold to suburban fathers, but in the lean, weathered fashion of a man who had watched hope die more than once and still managed to keep a fire lit. And each morning he walked his small plot of land, now cleared of debt and corporate liens thanks to the unexpected restitution Rebecca had offered in that letter, the one with the photo of his granddaughter that still sat on the mantel beside his military service pin and a brass Zippo lighter from Da Nang, and he found peace in the work, building raised beds, maintaining the gravel drive, tuning his old 1956 Farmall tractor back into growl-ready condition. And when Jonah stopped by each Sunday afternoon with a cooler of beer and a few cut planks for the new toolshed they were erecting, they talked less like father and son and more like co-conspirators in some quiet resistance to the modern world, where everything had to be monetized, simplified, optimized, and digitized, and though the old pain lingered, the betrayal still raw in certain conversations, especially when David's name came up, Tom felt the weight shifting, not disappearing, but moving from the front of his chest to the edges of memory where he could carry it without stumbling, and it was around this time that Lydia from the Amarillo Ledger called again, not with another excerpt request or update from the public radio circuit, but with something far more unexpected. "There's a professor at the University of Iowa organizing a symposium on post-war American masculinity and economic dislocation," she said, "and he wants you to speak." And Tom laughed hard at the idea of himself standing in front of a college crowd full of students who had never seen a steel mill, let alone worked in one, but Lydia was insistent, and eventually he agreed, more out of curiosity than conviction, and 2 months later he stood behind a podium in Iowa City, his boots freshly polished, his flannel shirt tucked in for once, facing a packed room of undergraduates, scholars, and even a few Vietnam veterans, and he read aloud from his story, the part where he described the day he signed away the land. "I told myself it was for the family, but deep down I knew I was just trying to stop the bleeding," and when he finished, there was silence, the kind of silence that comes not from disinterest but from impact, and a young woman in the front row, no older than Abigail now, raised her hand and asked, "Did you ever get it back? The family?" And Tom paused, then said, "Some of it came back in pieces. Some of it I had to build again with my own 2 hands." And afterward people lined up to shake his hand, not because he was famous, but because he had survived with something intact, his memory, his principles, his voice, and the professor handed him a stipend check and said, "You've done more for this conversation than 100 books." And back home, Jonah took to calling the porch Dad's stage, teasing him about his lecture tour, while Rebecca began writing letters more often, sometimes including stories about Abigail's school, her drawings, even an awkward but sincere apology from her husband, who had since stepped away from real estate and opened a small hardware store in Springfield, and though Tom never said it aloud, part of him began to believe that maybe the fracture hadn't been permanent after all, that there was still time, still space for redemption, even in the late chapters of a life. And then, in the summer of 1991, as he was organizing his documents for a local Veterans Benefits Appeal, one last attempt to correct a clerical error that had denied him full disability coverage, he received a certified letter from a D.C. law firm informing him that David Whitaker had passed away unexpectedly during a business trip to London, a stroke at 44, and though their last direct interaction had been in a courtroom years ago, and though Tom's feelings toward David had long since hardened into something closer to historical grief than personal anger, the news hit him like a sap to the gut, not because he mourned the man David had become, but because he mourned the father he had failed to remain when David most needed him, and in the days that followed, Tom did not speak of it, did not weep, but went about his work quietly, sorting papers, tending to the tomatoes, helping Jonah finish the tool shed, and it was only when Rebecca called, her voice strained, asking if he'd come to the funeral, that he said, "I'll be there, not for him, but for you and Abigail." And on a humid July afternoon, he stood among polished suits and floral wreaths outside a marble Episcopal chapel, wearing the same dark jacket he'd worn to Teresa's funeral decades earlier, his only suit, and when Abigail, now 9, walked up to him and asked, "Were you and my daddy friends when he was little?" Tom knelt and said, "We were a family." And that was all he could offer, and after the burial, he didn't attend the reception, didn't shake hands with lawyers or clients or colleagues of David's who spoke in gentle euphemisms, but returned home and sat on the porch, watching the wind curl through the trees, and he opened a new journal, leather-bound, a gift from Lydia, and began writing the next volume, not about betrayal this time, or sacrifice, but about endurance. About how a man can survive being gutted by the very thing he tried to protect, and still rise each day to plant, to build, to teach, and to speak, because silence, he now understood, was not peace, it was erasure, and as long as he breathed, he would not be erased. By the spring of 1993, Tom Whitaker's name had begun to carry a strange kind of weight in certain corners of American discourse, not in the circles of power or policy where polished men in Washington discussed blue-collar narratives, like wildlife biologists observe endangered species, but among the growing patchwork of regional journalists, labor historians, veterans advocacy groups, and forgotten communities scattered across the Rust Belt, Appalachia, and the South, where Tom's voice, preserved in essays, interviews, and grainy public access recordings, had come to represent something elusive and increasingly endangered, the moral backbone of a generation that had never learned the language of branding or personal marketing, but could read a man's soul in how he handled a broken promise. And Tom, now in his early 60s, moved through these days with the tired grace of someone who had learned to live with the weight of memory rather than try to outrun it, and when asked to speak, he did so rarely, but with precision, choosing his words like he chose his seeds, deliberately, with an understanding that what you plant now may feed someone long after you're gone. And it was in May of that year, during a talk in Dayton organized by a community college labor studies department, that Tom met Eleanor Draper, a retired union organizer from Toledo who had led the strike against Standard Glass in '78, and who, after hearing Tom's story, handed him a folder filled with handwritten notes, photocopies of payroll records, and a simple message. "They're rewriting our history. Maybe it's time we wrote it back." And Tom took that folder home, studied it by lamplight, and realized something he had long suspected: his family's betrayal, though deeply personal, had occurred in parallel with a systemic betrayal playing out across the country, one in which sacrifice was being rebranded as inefficiency, honor as stubbornness, and communal memory as outdated myth. And so he joined Eleanor and a small group of retired workers, archivists, and grassroots writers in what they called the Backbone Project, an effort to collect oral histories, primary source documents, and community testimony from those who had lived through the deindustrialization of America not as an economic theory but as a daily erosion of dignity. And Tom contributed not just his story, but his method, his way of framing pain as evidence, not complaint, and together they created a series of traveling exhibits that moved from VFW halls to high school gyms to church basements, each one featuring rusted tools, family ledgers, military discharge papers, eviction notices, and personal letters written in ink that had begun to fade but whose meaning burned brighter with each year. And as these stories spread, journalists began to take notice, not the cable networks still obsessed with scandal and spectacle, but independent documentarians, public radio programs, and one reporter from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch named Luis Carrillo, whose feature on Tom and the Backbone Project was titled "The Man Who Refused to Disappear," and whose closing line read, "Some men raise flags, others plant seeds, Tom Whitaker did both." And the article struck a nerve, especially after it was shared in a congressional hearing on Veterans Affairs in 1994, where a staffer for Senator Paul Wellstone entered it into the record during testimony on VA mismanagement and the long-term neglect of rural combat veterans. And Tom, stunned to hear his name in a building he had once assumed would outlive him without ever knowing he existed, watched the C-SPAN clip on a grainy VHS copy mailed to him by Jonah, who had recorded it during a night shift at the cable co-op in Springfield where he now worked full-time, and in that moment, Tom felt not pride but confirmation that his words, his losses, his pain had become something larger than himself, a kind of living proof that you didn't need a monument or a pension to shape the story of your country. And yet, just as the tide began to shift, life reminded him that the past does not stay quiet forever, because that summer, while reviewing county tax assessments after a neighbor's property was threatened by eminent domain for a proposed highway expansion, Tom discovered that a dormant lien had been reactivated on the very land he had reclaimed. A lien tied not to current debts but to a 1982 legal structure filed by a shell corporation. That traced back to one of David's original firms, an entity that, despite David's death, had somehow survived in legal limbo, still operating through automated systems and distant boards that saw Tom's trailer and garden not as a home, but as a resource. And so began a new battle, this time not for memory or recognition, but for the right to remain on the land his great-grandfather had cleared after the Civil War, and Tom, unwilling to go quietly, enlisted help from the same network he had helped inspire: law students from the university who had read his essays, pro bono legal advocates from a nearby veterans coalition, and even an old friend from the county assessor's office who had known Tom's family since Eisenhower was in office, and together they filed injunctions, uncovered inconsistencies, and eventually forced a hearing before the State Land Commission, where Tom, in a borrowed suit and with a trembling hand, read from a document titled Affidavit of the Common Man, in which he stated, "This land is not simply soil, it is my past, my cost, and my country." And the board, facing growing public pressure and a media profile that had made Tom something of a regional symbol, ruled in his favor, nullifying the lien and declaring the property residential heritage land, a classification that protected it from corporate seizure. And when he walked out of that hearing, flanked by Jonah on one side and Eleanor Draper on the other, Tom said only, "That's one for the ledger." And in the months that followed, he went back to planting, to fixing his truck, to watching sunsets with a mug of black coffee and a notebook always nearby. And when Abigail, now 14, came to spend a week with him that fall, she asked if he'd help her with a school project on American heroes, and he said, "I'm no hero." But she replied, "You are to me." And together they built a model of the old mill town as it once was, using matchsticks, popsicle sticks, and fragments of the past that still lingered in Tom's shed. And on the final day of her visit, she handed him a card that read, "Thank you for not giving up when it would have been easier to disappear." And Tom, reading it alone that night by lamplight, placed it in the same box as all the others, the letters, the clippings, the evidence, and whispered aloud to the wind curling past the porch, "I didn't do it for glory. I did it so they'd know we were here." The final years of Tom Whitaker's life didn't come with the quiet retreat many men imagine when they think of old age, not with rocking chairs and fishing lines and birthdays celebrated by 3 generations under one roof, but with the unrelenting cadence of a man who had chosen not to disappear, who woke every morning at 5:30 sharp with black coffee and a pencil in hand, scribbling lines into his notebook not because anyone asked him to, but because he believed that telling the truth, even when no one's listening, is the last dignified act left to a man whose life has been taken from him one piece at a time. And as the 1990s stumbled into the digital age, with fax machines giving way to email and strangers on message boards beginning to find each other through shared loss and common cause, Tom's story, originally published in small-town columns and handwritten pamphlets, began to spread in new ways. Translated by grad students into PDFs passed around by activists, quoted in Union newsletters in Pennsylvania and Oregon, and referenced in obscure forums where combat veterans and downsized factory workers talked less about politics and more about pain. And somewhere along the way, the man who once stood alone on a porch in southern Illinois became an unofficial symbol, not of heroism or defiance, but of refusal, a man who had been offered silence and chose instead to speak, who had been given every reason to vanish and instead planted his boots in the same soil his great-grandfather once plowed and said simply, "No." And by the time the year 2000 rolled around and the nation turned its eyes to Florida ballots and Y2K paranoia, Tom Whitaker had already written his last full letter, a 12-page missive to Abigail, now in college and studying social work, in which he explained not just what had happened to him, but why it mattered, how the country had learned to reward those who forgot where they came from and punish those who tried to remember, how wealth had been mistaken for wisdom and betrayal rebranded as pragmatism, and how the hardest thing he ever did wasn't surviving the jungle or the courtroom, but waking up each day knowing that the people he loved had once seen him as disposable and choosing to love them anyway. And that letter was never published, never archived, never leaked online. It remained folded in a drawer next to a stack of war medals and the deed to the land that had nearly been stolen. And when Tom passed in the early spring of 2002, not from illness or trauma, but simply from the long, quiet toll of where Jonah found that letter, and instead of keeping it private, he read it aloud at the modest service held behind the house, where fewer than 30 people gathered under a wide Illinois sky, some wearing old denim, others in work boots, a few in military dress, but all with heads bowed not in mourning, but in acknowledgement. Because they knew that the man in the box had not lived an easy life, or even a happy one, but a true one, and the final paragraph of that letter was later reprinted in American Voices, a quarterly publication for rural veterans and displaced workers, and it read, "I gave up everything for my family not because I was brave, but because I believed they were my country, and I was wrong, not about loving them, but about thinking love guaranteed loyalty. Because in this country, nothing is guaranteed, not even the things you bleed for, and yet if I had to do it again I would because sacrifice only loses meaning when you let it turn to bitterness instead of planting it like a seed and hoping someone, someday, finds the strength to grow something better from it." And that final sentence, "hoping someone, someday, finds the strength to grow something better," was carved into the base of the plain headstone that marked Tom Whitaker's grave, beneath a sycamore tree planted by Jonah and Abigail a week later, and it became a place people visited not for grief, but for guidance, a stop along a rural highway where bus drivers pulled over to read the inscription to wide-eyed teens, where veterans left challenge coins and patches, where young fathers came to sit with a story older than themselves and tried to understand what it means to give everything and still lose what mattered most, and what it means to hold the line anyway. And if you visit that grave today, 20 years later, you won't find flowers or flags or polished marble, just a small wooden bench with initials carved into the side, initials that read TW, and above them, 3 words that outlived betrayal. He stayed honest. Thank you for being with us on Whispers Secrets. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. The secrets are waiting to be revealed. See you soon.